I thought my son's wife was sweet until I found her passport and called the FBI. Oh, honey, let me tell you about the day my entire world came crashing down. The day I found two passports taped under my daughter in law's kitchen table and realized I'd been living with complete strangers for 3 years. One passport said Svetlana Volkov from Russia. You know, the sweet girl who brought me homemade soup when I was sick and always asked about my day. The other one, Sarah Chen from Sacramento, someone I'd never heard of in my life, who'd been planning to steal my $3.2 million inheritance and, God help me, probably murder me to get it. I'm still shaking just thinking about it, even 2 years later. But listen, I need to start from the beginning because you have to understand how a 67-year-old grandmother like me ended up calling the FBI on her own son. You need to know how what I thought was the most loving family dinner of my life turned out to be three people calmly planning my death over Chinese takeout from our usual place. My name is Margaret Henderson, and what I'm about to tell you, well, it's going to sound like something out of a movie, but I swear on my late husband's grave, every single word of this is true. This is the story of how I discovered that the people I loved most in this world were professional criminals, and how I helped the FBI take down an entire criminal organization that had been murdering elderly people like me across 6 states for over a decade. Sweetheart, you're going to want to hear every detail of this nightmare. 3 years ago, God, was I naive. I thought I'd hit the mother-in-law jackpot. For 3 blissful, stupid years, I believed my son David had married an absolute angel. Svetlana was everything I'd ever dreamed of in a daughter-in-law. Sweet as apple pie. Always fussing over me, bringing me homemade borscht when I wasn't feeling well, calling every Tuesday night just to chat about my week. You know how some mothers are always complaining about their sons' wives, rolling their eyes and whispering about these ungrateful girls who stole their boys? Well, I used to feel genuinely sorry for those poor women. I'd sit there stirring my morning coffee, thinking, oh, you poor things, you just don't have a Svetlana in your lives. She had this gorgeous, soft Russian accent that made even the most ordinary things sound elegant and sophisticated. When she'd ask if I wanted more tea or comment on the weather, it was like listening to poetry. And my David, my 35-year-old software engineer baby, he was happier than I'd ever seen him in his entire life. I'd watch his whole face light up when she walked into a room, the way he'd practically trip over himself to pull out her chair or fetch her a glass of water before she even asked. After his divorce 3 years earlier, and honey, that was a mess, his ex-wife took half his savings and left his heart in pieces. I honestly wondered if my boy would ever trust love again. When he brought Svetlana home to meet me, I saw hope return to his eyes for the first time in years. It was like watching my son come back to life. She would call me every single Tuesday evening, right at 7 o'clock, just to chat. She remembered all my book club friends by name, asked about my roses in the garden, even offered to drive me to doctor's appointments when David was traveling for work. When I had to put my beloved cat, Mr. Whiskers, to sleep last fall, he was 17, bless his heart, Svetlana showed up at my door with tissues, chocolate, and the biggest hug you can imagine. But here's what I should have known, what my gut was trying to tell me, but I was too stubborn to listen. When someone seems absolutely perfect, they usually aren't. And the more perfect they seem on the surface, the more rotten they are underneath. I should have trusted that nagging feeling in the back of my mind, that little voice whispering that something wasn't quite right. But I wanted so desperately to believe that David had found happiness after that awful divorce, that I'd finally gained the daughter I'd never had. So I pushed those doubts aside like a fool. God in heaven, how I wish I'd listened to that voice earlier. Now let me tell you about myself, because you need to understand why they targeted me in the first place. I'm not your typical grandmother scraping by on Social Security checks. My late husband, Frank, may he rest in peace, and I built something really special together over 35 years of marriage. We started with absolutely nothing, honey, and I mean nothing. Frank was working construction when we met, coming home every night with dirt caked under his fingernails and muscles that ached so bad he could barely move. I was slinging hash at a diner downtown, trying to save enough pennies for nursing school. We lived in this tiny apartment above Mrs. Kowalski's bakery, and our idea of a fancy date was splitting a pizza and taking a walk through the park. But Frank, bless his heart, had vision. He could see how this construction boom was creating huge demand for quality hardware and building supplies. Instead of just working for other people his whole life, he convinced me to pool our pathetic little savings and open our own hardware store. I was terrified. What did we know about running a business? But Frank had this way of making impossible dreams seem not just possible, but inevitable. That first store was barely 800 square feet, squeezed between Mickey's barber shop and a used bookstore that smelled like old cigarettes. We worked 18-hour days, 7 days a week. I handled the books and talked to customers, while Frank managed inventory and sweet talk suppliers. We ate ramen noodles for dinner more nights than I care to remember, and every single penny went right back into the business. But slowly, year by year, we built something incredible. One store became two, then three, then more. By the time my Frank passed away 5 years ago, sudden heart attack, just like that, gone in an instant. We owned a successful chain of 12 hardware stores across 3 states. When all the lawyers finished with his estate, I inherited everything. And sweetheart, I mean everything. We're talking about $3.2 million dollars in liquid assets, plus our family home worth another $800,000, plus ongoing royalties from when I sold the stores to a national chain, but kept smart agreements that still pay me every month. Now David knew we were comfortable, but he had no idea about the real extent of our wealth. Frank and I had always been careful about money, never flashy or showing off. I drove the same reliable Honda Accord for 12 years and still shopped at discount stores out of pure habit. I lived modestly in the same 4-bedroom house where we'd raised David, and most people, including my own son, figured I was just getting by comfortably on Frank's pension and Social Security. The truth was, I'd been quietly planning to leave every penny to David. He was my only child, my whole world. Sure, we'd had some rough patches when he was younger, the usual teenage nonsense, some questionable choices in his 20s that gave me gray hair, but he'd grown into what I thought was a good, decent, responsible man. He had a steady job, seemed to have learned from his mistakes, and after meeting Svetlana, appeared to be building the kind of solid, loving life that Frank and I had always dreamed of for him. Oh, honey, if only I'd known what he really was. Looking back now, there were red flags everywhere, warning signs flashing like neon lights that I was too blind with love to see. The first thing that should have bothered me was how Svetlana's story about her background kept shifting in these tiny little ways. She claimed to be from some small town called Volgograd in Russia, but sometimes she'd mention details that just didn't add up. One day she'd talk about these brutal winters where they had to bundle up in layers and layers of wool, but then she'd casually mention swimming in a nearby lake during summer months. Now I'm no geography expert, but that seemed odd for a region everyone says has such harsh weather. Even more troubling was how her accent would slip sometimes. Most of the time, she had this beautiful, distinctly Russian way of speaking that was like music to my ears. But every now and then, especially when she was tired or stressed, she'd pronounce certain words in a way that sounded, well, completely American. When I'd gently ask about it, she'd laugh it off and say she'd been watching too much American television, that she was losing her beautiful mother tongue. Then there were those mysterious phone calls. At least twice during every single visit to my house, Svetlana would excuse herself to take a call, always stepping outside or disappearing into another room for privacy. She'd speak in rapid Russian, or what I assumed was Russian, and her whole tone would change, become serious, almost businesslike. When she'd come back, I'd ask if everything was okay, and she'd wave her hand dismissively and say it was just her sister or her mother checking in from the old country. But here's what really should have set off every alarm bell in my head. She was absolutely obsessed with our family history, especially anything and everything related to Frank's business success and our financial situation. She'd ask these questions so sweetly, so innocently, that they seemed like genuine curiosity about family legacy. Oh, Margaret, she'd coo while we looked through old family photographs. David's papa must have been such a brilliant businessman. I would love to learn about how he built everything from nothing. It's so inspiring to hear about the American dream really coming true. She wanted to know everything about the hardware stores, how many Frank had owned, when exactly he'd sold them, what kind of financial arrangements he'd made. She asked about our investments, our property, even personal things like life insurance policies and retirement accounts. When I'd mentioned that some of these topics were quite private, she'd immediately apologize and say she was just so impressed by what Frank had accomplished that she hoped she and David could build something similar together someday. I thought her curiosity was sweet, maybe even a little ambitious in a good way. Now I realize she was conducting the most thorough financial background investigation I've ever experienced, and I was sitting there like an idiot, voluntarily providing every piece of information she needed to destroy me. The biggest red flag of all, and I hate myself for missing this, was how she seemed to have no real friends or connections from her supposed past. In 3 whole years, I never met a single person who claimed to have known her before she started dating David. No childhood friends, no former coworkers, nobody from this mysterious life in Russia she was always talking about. When I'd ask about old friends or family back home, she'd get this distant, almost melancholy expression and say that moving to America had meant leaving everything behind. It's the price of love, she'd say, with this sad little sigh. Sometimes you must choose between your past and your future. I found this romantic and touching, like something out of a movie. What an absolute fool I was. 3 months ago, everything in my safe, predictable little world got turned completely upside down. I had what the doctors called a cardiac episode, which sounds so much gentler than the reality of feeling like a freight train was sitting on my chest while lightning bolts shot down my left arm. It happened on a Tuesday morning while I was out watering my prize-winning roses. One moment I was admiring how beautiful they looked in the morning sun, and the next I was on my knees in the dirt, gasping for air and honestly wondering if this was how my story was going to end. Thank God for my neighbor, Mrs. Patterson. She saw me collapse through her kitchen window and called 911 immediately. The paramedics kept reassuring me it was a relatively mild heart attack, but let me tell you, those 4 days in the hospital felt like the longest month of my life. The constant beeping of machines, the parade of doctors and nurses poking and prodding, that awful hospital gown that never stayed closed properly. It all made me feel more vulnerable and mortal than I'd felt since losing Frank. But what really opened my eyes wasn't the medical crisis itself. It was watching how David and Svetlana reacted to my situation. David, to his credit, seemed genuinely worried and spent every single evening at my bedside, bringing crossword puzzles and gossiping about his coworkers to keep my spirits up. But Svetlana's behavior struck me as, well, strange. While I was lying there hooked up to heart monitors and scared out of my mind about my future, she kept steering our conversations toward my important papers and legal arrangements. On the second day, I overheard her talking to David in the hallway right outside my room, their voices low but urgent. "We need to make sure everything is properly organized," she was saying. What if something worse had happened? What if she hadn't been able to communicate her wishes clearly? "Mom's going to be fine," David replied, but I could hear uncertainty creeping into his voice. "Of course she will be," Svetlana agreed quickly. "But this is a wake-up call, yes? We should help her get everything in perfect order, just in case. It would give her such peace of mind to know everything is handled." Just in case of what? The doctors had been crystal clear that while I needed to make some lifestyle changes and take medication, this wasn't a life-threatening situation. I wasn't dying, wasn't even close to dying. But there was Svetlana, already making plans for my incapacity or death like it was just a matter of time. When they came back into my room, Svetlana was all smiles and concern again, fluffing my pillows and asking if I needed anything. But I'd heard enough of their conversation to feel deeply, deeply unsettled. That night, lying alone in that hospital bed with machines beeping around me, I started paying attention to details I'd been ignoring for 3 long years. And what I saw, once I really started looking, absolutely terrified me. A week after I came home from the hospital, still feeling shaky and overwhelmed by my new reality of daily medications and dietary restrictions, Svetlana made what seemed like the sweetest offer in the world. "Margaret," she said, settling beside me on my living room couch with that concerned expression I'd grown so used to. "I've been thinking and thinking about what happened at the hospital, how frightened we all were. David and we want to help you organize all your important documents and papers, just so everything is easy to find if there's ever another emergency." She explained how many people don't realize how complicated things can become when someone gets hospitalized unexpectedly. What if I'd been unconscious longer? What if the doctors had needed to contact my insurance company quickly or access my medical history? What if David had needed to handle my bills or financial obligations while I recovered? "It would give all of us such peace of mind," she continued in that sweet voice, "to know that everything is organized and accessible. I have some experience with this kind of paperwork organization from helping my elderly neighbors back in Russia." Her reasoning sounded absolutely logical and thoughtful. Here was my loving daughter-in-law, offering to spend her precious free time helping me tackle the boring but necessary task of organizing decades' worth of accumulated documents, financial records, and legal papers. What daughter-in-law wouldn't want to help during her mother-in-law's recovery? So I gave her a key to my house and told her where I kept my filing cabinets. 2 large oak cabinets in Frank's old study, plus a fireproof safe where I stored the most important documents like birth certificates, insurance policies, and property deeds. I explained my somewhat chaotic filing system and apologized for how disorganized everything had become since Frank's death. "Don't you worry one bit about the mess," Svetlana assured me with that angelic smile. "I'll have everything neat and organized in no time. You just rest and let me take care of this for you." She spent 3 solid hours at my house that Thursday afternoon while I was at a follow-up appointment with my cardiologist. When I came home, she was just finishing up, looking slightly flushed but satisfied with her work. "I made such wonderful progress," she reported cheerfully. "Your filing system is actually much better than you think, Margaret. I just reorganized a few things and made some lists of where everything is located. Now you'll be able to find whatever you need in seconds." She showed me several handwritten pages of notes, lists of document locations, insurance policy numbers, account information. It all looked incredibly thorough and helpful. She'd even organized my desk drawers and tidied up Frank's old study, which had honestly become a bit of a storage room since his death. "Thank you so much, sweetheart," I told her, genuinely grateful for what seemed like hours of tedious work done out of pure love and concern. "I honestly don't know what I'd do without you and David." "That's what family is for," she replied, giving me one of her warm hugs. "We take care of each other, always." But here's what that sweet little Svetlana didn't know about me. I might be 67 years old and recently diagnosed with heart problems, but I'm not nearly as helpless or trusting as I appear to be. Frank always used to say I had excellent instincts about people, and something about this whole situation was making those instincts scream warnings I couldn't ignore. So that evening, after Svetlana had gone home and I'd eaten my bland, low sodium dinner and taken all my new medications, I decided to check something that Frank had insisted on installing 2 years earlier: a comprehensive security system with cameras throughout the house. Honey, I'll never forget sitting in my living room that Thursday night, my laptop balanced on my knees, watching security footage that made my blood turn to absolute ice. Svetlana hadn't been organizing my documents. She'd been systematically photographing every single financial paper in my house. The footage showed her moving through Frank's study with what looked like military precision, opening every file folder, pulling out bank statements, investment portfolios, property deeds, insurance policies, tax returns, anything and everything that revealed the true extent of my financial situation. But instead of organizing these papers like she'd claimed, she was photographing each document with her smartphone, taking multiple shots from different angles to make sure she got everything clearly. But, sweetheart, the most bone chilling part wasn't what she was doing, it was how she was doing it. This wasn't the behavior of someone who'd suddenly decided to snoop through personal papers out of curiosity. This was methodical, professional, practiced. She knew exactly what she was looking for and exactly how to find it efficiently. Even worse, she was on the phone during the entire 3 hour period, speaking in what sounded like Russian but could have been any foreign language for all I knew. She'd photograph a document, then hold it up to show whoever was on the other end of that call while describing what she'd found. "Da, da," I heard her saying over and over, though the audio quality made it hard to understand everything. But certain phrases came through crystal clear. "Much more money than we expected," "multiple investment accounts," "extensive property ownership," "substantial life insurance." She wasn't gathering information for some innocent family organization project. She was conducting what looked like professional financial reconnaissance, reporting her findings to someone else in real time like some kind of spy. I watched 3 hours of that footage, my heart pounding harder than it had during my actual heart attack. This sweet, caring daughter-in-law I'd grown to love like my own child over 3 years was a complete and total stranger. The woman who brought me homemade soup when I was sick, who called every Tuesday to check on me, who had seemed like an answer to my prayers for David's happiness. That woman was systematically cataloging my assets like a professional thief casing a bank. But why? What was the end game here? And dear God, was David involved, or was he just another victim of whatever sick game Svetlana was playing? I didn't sleep one wink that night. I sat in my kitchen until the sun came up, drinking coffee after coffee and trying to process what I'd witnessed. By the time dawn broke, I'd made a decision that would change absolutely everything. I was going to find out exactly who Svetlana really was, even if the truth destroyed the family I thought I'd finally found. The day after watching that devastating security footage, I did something I never in my wildest dreams imagined I'd need to do. I hired a private investigator to investigate my own family. Jerry Martinez came recommended by my neighbor, Mrs. Patterson. The same sweet woman who'd called 911 when I had my heart attack. Her teenage grandson had run away from home 2 years earlier, and Jerry had tracked him down within a week. He was a retired police detective who specialized in missing persons and background investigations, with this weathered, kind face and gentle manner that made you want to trust him immediately. I met Jerry at a little coffee shop clear across town, somewhere I was unlikely to run into anyone I knew. I'd brought printouts of some of the security footage, though the image quality wasn't perfect, and I'd written down everything I could remember about Svetlana's behavior and all her claims about her background. Mrs. Henderson, Jerry said after carefully reviewing all my materials, I have to ask you something important. Are you absolutely certain you want to pursue this investigation? Sometimes when we go looking for truth, we find things we desperately wish we'd never discovered. I thought about that question seriously, honey. Did I really want to know if the past 3 years of my life had been built on lies? Did I want to risk destroying David's happiness if Svetlana turned out to be genuinely innocent and I was just a paranoid old woman letting security footage feed unfounded suspicions? But then I remembered the methodical, professional way she'd photographed my financial documents, those mysterious phone calls in foreign languages, the constant probing questions about Frank's business and our family assets. This wasn't paranoia talking. This was pattern recognition from a woman who'd been around long enough to spot trouble. Jerry, I said, looking him straight in the eye, I need to know who she really is, even if the truth is uglier than I can imagine. This kind of investigation takes time, he warned me seriously. Background checks, identity verification, financial history searches, cross-referencing with law enforcement databases. We're talking about at least 2 weeks of intensive work, possibly longer, and I have to be honest, it's not going to be cheap. I didn't care about the cost. Frank had left me comfortable enough that I could afford to learn the truth about the woman who'd married my son and somehow gained access to my most private financial information. Find out everything, I told Jerry firmly. I want to know who Svetlana really is, where she actually came from, and what she's really doing in my family. Everything. Jerry nodded grimly. I'll start with basic identity verification and work from there. If she's not who she claims to be, we'll find out. And Mrs. Henderson? Yes? If my gut instincts are right about this situation, you're going to need to be extremely careful moving forward. Don't let on that you suspect anything. Keep acting completely normal around both of them until we know exactly what we're dealing with. That advice turned out to be much, much harder to follow than I'd anticipated. The next 2 weeks were among the most difficult of my entire life. I had to continue my normal routine, weekly dinners with David and Svetlana, phone calls, casual visits, while knowing that I was probably sitting across the table from people who were actively planning to rob me blind. Every Tuesday evening when Svetlana called for our usual chat, I had to make cheerful small talk about my garden and my book club while wondering what she was really after. When David stopped by to check on my recovery and asked seemingly innocent questions about my finances, I had to try to figure out whether he was being a caring son or gathering intelligence for some larger, more sinister scheme. The hardest part was watching them interact with each other. They seemed so genuinely affectionate, sharing inside jokes and those small, intimate gestures that looked like real, true love. Either they were both incredible actors putting on the performance of their lives, or at least one of them was completely innocent in whatever game was being played here. I found myself analyzing every single conversation, every gesture, every seemingly casual question with a fine-tooth comb. When Svetlana mentioned that a friend of hers was thinking about buying investment property and asked about my experience with real estate, was she making innocent conversation or fishing for specific information? When David offered to help me organize my financial documents since Svetlana had made such good progress, was he trying to be helpful or looking for another opportunity to access my private papers? The paranoia was absolutely exhausting. I'd lie awake at night replaying conversations over and over, wondering if I was losing my mind or if my family was really planning to betray me in the worst possible way. Meanwhile, Jerry was working his investigation like a dog. He'd call every few days with progress reports that were both reassuring and terrifying at the same time. Reassuring because they confirmed I wasn't going crazy? There really were serious, legitimate questions about Svetlana's identity and background. Terrifying because each new piece of information suggested that whatever was happening was far more sophisticated and dangerous than simple theft. Margaret, Jerry told me during one of our coffee shop meetings, his expression grim. I'm finding some very disturbing inconsistencies in her background story. The information she's given your family doesn't match any official records I can locate anywhere. What kind of inconsistencies? I asked, my heart already sinking. Well, for starters, there's absolutely no record of anyone named Svetlana Volkov entering the United States from Russia during the time frame when she supposedly arrived here. No visa applications, no immigration records, no customs documentation, no paper trail at all. I felt like someone had punched me in the stomach. So she's here illegally? That's one possibility, but there's another explanation that's even more troubling. Jerry pulled out a thick manila folder and spread several documents across our small table. I've been cross-referencing her personal details, physical description, approximate age, the few verifiable facts about her background that we can check, with national databases of known identity fraud cases. He showed me photographs of several different women, all roughly similar in appearance to Svetlana, all connected to various financial crimes across multiple states over the past several years. Margaret, Jerry said quietly, I think your daughter-in-law might be part of something much bigger and more dangerous than simple document theft. I think she might be part of an organized marriage fraud operation. Jerry's next revelation hit me like a physical blow to the chest. He'd found evidence suggesting that Svetlana wasn't just using a false identity for some simple scam. She was part of what appeared to be a highly sophisticated criminal organization that specialized in targeting older adults with significant assets. Marriage fraud operations like this are unfortunately much more common than most people realize, Jerry explained during our third meeting, his voice heavy with concern. Criminal organizations recruit attractive women from various backgrounds, provide them with completely false identities and carefully manufactured backstories, then deploy them like weapons to form relationships with specific, carefully chosen targets. The scope of what Jerry was describing made my head spin like a top. This wasn't just some opportunistic thief who'd gotten lucky by meeting David at the right time and place. This was a calculated professional operation that had specifically targeted our family like hunters stalking prey. But then Jerry discovered something that broke my heart completely. David wasn't just an innocent victim. The evidence suggested he was an active participant in the scheme to rob me. What Jerry discovered about David's potential involvement was even more devastating than learning about Svetlana's false identity. My son wasn't just an innocent victim who'd been manipulated by a skilled con artist. The evidence strongly suggested he was an active, willing participant in whatever scheme was targeting me. Margaret, I'm so sorry to have to show you this, Jerry said during our fourth meeting, his expression full of genuine sympathy. But your son has been making some extremely suspicious financial moves over the past 2 years that don't make sense for someone living on his legitimate income. The evidence was overwhelming. bank records showing David had taken out a $50,000 loan against his retirement account right after marrying Svetlana, credit card statements showing expensive purchases, followed by immediate cash advances, phone records proving David had called my insurance agent asking detailed questions about my life insurance policies. Most damning of all, Jerry had discovered that David had been involved in similar operations in other states before targeting me. He wasn't just another victim, he was what they called a family infiltrator, someone whose job was to identify targets, gain their trust, and maintain access to their lives and finances. How many other families has he helped destroy? I asked, my voice barely a whisper. Based on what we've learned so far, at least 6 other elderly victims, possibly many more. I felt like I was drowning in betrayal. The son I'd raised, the child I'd loved unconditionally, that person had never really existed. The real David was a professional criminal who specialized in targeting elderly people like me. I want him arrested, I said. I want them both arrested immediately. We understand that feeling, Jerry replied carefully. But Margaret, if we move too quickly, the rest of their organization will disappear. This is bigger than just David and Svetlana. We need to contact the FBI. The next morning, I did something I never imagined I'd need to do in my worst nightmares. I called the FBI. Jerry's contact was Agent Lisa Rodriguez, a specialist in financial crimes who worked out of the Denver field office. When Jerry called her and described what we'd uncovered, she was on a plane to our city within 18 hours. Meeting Agent Rodriguez was absolutely surreal, honey. She was younger than I'd expected, but had this unshakable authority that comes from years of dealing with the worst kinds of human behavior. After reviewing our evidence, she delivered news that changed everything. Mrs. Henderson, Agent Rodriguez said, what you've uncovered could help us shut down a major criminal enterprise that we've been tracking for over 2 years. You may have just given us the breakthrough we've been desperately looking for. She explained that the FBI had been investigating a marriage fraud network operating across multiple states. The organization was incredibly sophisticated, with stolen identities, forged documents, and connections to international money laundering operations. We've identified at least 30 confirmed victims so far, with total losses exceeding $5 million. But you're in a unique position. You've discovered their operation before they've stolen your money. We want to use you as bait. Agent Rodriguez's plan was both elegant and terrifying. Instead of arresting David and Svetlana immediately, we would let them think their plan was working while the FBI gathered evidence against the entire criminal network. They installed sophisticated surveillance equipment throughout my house and assigned me a handler who could communicate with me through a tiny earpiece. The hardest part would be continuing to act normal around David and Svetlana while knowing they were planning to rob and possibly murder me. If they realize you're suspicious, Agent Rodriguez warned, they might accelerate their timeline or consider you a direct threat. We'll have agents watching you 24/7, but there's always some level of danger. I thought about Frank, about how he'd always said some fights are worth the risk. If I didn't help stop this organization, how many other elderly people would lose their life savings? How many other families would be destroyed? What do you need me to do? I asked. 3 days later, I called David and told him I was ready to move forward with organizing my finances immediately. I said my recent health scare had made me anxious to get everything settled. That's really smart thinking, Mom, David said, and I could hear the barely contained excitement in his voice. Svetlana and I would love to help you figure out the best way to organize everything. We arranged to have dinner that Saturday to discuss my financial arrangements. What followed was the most chilling evening of my life, as I watched my son and his wife systematically plan to gain complete control over my life and money. They suggested consolidating all my accounts, adding them as authorized users, and having me sign power of attorney documents. They made it all sound so reasonable and caring, but I could hear the real message. They wanted complete access to my money and legal authority to control my life. Through my earpiece, Agent Chen's voice confirmed, "Outstanding work, Mrs. Henderson. They've essentially confessed to conspiracy to commit elder fraud on federal recording equipment." But the worst was yet to come. 2 days later, Agent Rodriguez called with devastating news. The surveillance equipment had picked up David and Svetlana talking in their car after leaving my house. "She's completely ready," David was saying. "We should be able to complete the asset transfer within 2 weeks." But then they discussed what they called the endgame scenario. "If she starts asking too many questions," David said, "we might need to accelerate to phase 3. "What's phase 3? Svetlana asked. "Medical emergency. Make it look like another heart attack, but more severe. With her existing condition, no one would question it." Agent Rodriguez stopped the recording. "They're talking about murdering you. This isn't just financial fraud anymore. This is conspiracy to commit premeditated murder." I couldn't speak. My own son was casually discussing my murder like it was just another business transaction. The FBI's plan for the final phase was simple. I would call David and tell him I wanted to add them to my bank accounts immediately. We arranged to meet at First National Bank the next morning. When we arrived at the bank, everything seemed normal at first, but when the bank manager tried to verify Svetlana's passport, there was a problem. The numbers weren't coming up in their system. I watched David and Svetlana exchange a look that made my blood run cold. This wasn't the look of people dealing with a bureaucratic inconvenience. It was the look of criminals realizing their operation was in jeopardy. When I suggested we could just add David to my accounts and deal with Svetlana's paperwork later, David's mask slipped completely. For just a second, I saw pure calculation in his eyes. "Mom," he said carefully, "I think it would be better if we handle everything at once." Through my earpiece, Agent Chen's voice was urgent. "Don't leave with them, Mrs. Henderson. We need to separate you from them now." "Actually," I said, "I'm feeling tired. Why don't you two go ahead? I'll call my neighbor to pick me up." David's voice took on a threatening undertone. "I don't think you should be alone right now, especially after mentioning those chest pains. Let us drive you home." When Svetlana reached over and took my phone away, saying we should stick together, I knew I was in immediate danger. Suddenly, the office door burst open, and Agent Rodriguez walked in with other federal agents. "FBI," she announced. "Nobody move. David Henderson and Sarah Chen, you're under arrest for conspiracy to commit wire fraud, elder abuse, attempted theft, and conspiracy to commit murder." Sarah Chen. So that was Svetlana's real name. Even with FBI agents placing him under arrest, David tried to maintain his innocent act. "Mom? What's going on? What are they talking about?" But Agent Rodriguez had recordings of him discussing plans to murder me, evidence of his involvement in similar frauds in other states, and bank records showing payments he'd received for targeting elderly victims. That's when David's mask finally came off completely. "You manipulative old bitch," he snarled at me. "You knew the whole time, didn't you?" And there it was, the real David finally revealed. Not my loving son who'd been manipulated by criminals, but a professional predator who was furious that his intended victim had outsmarted him. "No," I said quietly as they led him away in handcuffs. "I only found out who you really are 3 weeks ago. I didn't raise you to be this person, David. You chose to become this monster." Within hours, the FBI used intelligence from our operation to arrest Patricia Wells, the coordinator who'd been running the entire marriage fraud network. She was a 45-year-old former insurance investigator who'd been running these schemes for over a decade. When they arrested her, she was carrying detailed files on over 40 potential victims. The scope was staggering. Researchers who identified targets, identity specialists who created false backgrounds, financial experts who laundered stolen assets through offshore accounts. We've recovered over $2 million in stolen assets, Agent Rodriguez told me, and we've connected this organization to at least 12 suspicious deaths of elderly victims across 6 states. 12 people had died. If I hadn't discovered Sarah's false passport, if I hadn't fought back, I would have been the 13th victim. The trials began 8 months later. I attended every day of David's trial, sitting in the front row where he could see me. I wanted him to look at the mother he'd tried to destroy and remember that his victim had been stronger than he'd anticipated. Sarah Chen testified against both David and Patricia Wells, revealing how she'd been recruited and trained to manipulate elderly targets. David Henderson personally approached our organization about targeting his own mother, she testified. He provided detailed financial information about her assets and helped plan the 3-year operation. For 3 years, every conversation, every family dinner, every expression of love had been part of an elaborate plan to rob and murder me. When it was my turn to give a victim impact statement, I looked directly at David. I spent 35 years loving you, supporting you, and believing in you, I told him. I would have given you everything if you'd simply asked. Instead, you chose to lie to me, manipulate me, and plan to murder me for money you didn't even need. But most importantly, you participated in an organization that destroyed dozens of families and killed at least 12 innocent people. David never looked at me, never showed remorse. The judge sentenced him to 18 years in federal prison. Sarah Chen received 12 years and deportation. Patricia Wells got 25 years to life. It's been 2 years since the arrests. I sold the house where David grew up, too many painful memories, and moved across town for a fresh start. I used my settlement to establish a foundation helping elderly victims of financial fraud. We've already helped recover assets for dozens of families and provided support for people who've experienced similar betrayals. The work that means most to me is our monthly support groups for other victims. We sit in a circle and share our stories, our pain, and slowly help each other heal. The hardest part isn't losing the money, said Eleanor, whose nephew had stolen her life savings. It's losing your faith in family, in your own judgment about people. I understand that pain completely. For months, I questioned every relationship, stopped trusting my instincts. But gradually, I've learned that evil like David's is rare. Most people are genuinely good. The criminals are just skilled at mimicking those qualities. Do I miss David? I miss the son I thought I had, but that person never existed. The real David was someone who could look at his own mother and see only dollar signs. That person isn't worth missing. I sleep better now, knowing he can't hurt anyone for the next 16 years. Every time we help another victim, every time we prevent another family from this betrayal, I remember that sometimes our worst experiences become our most meaningful purpose. David thought he was targeting a helpless old woman. Instead, he discovered his mother was someone who refused to be a victim, someone with the strength to fight back, someone who would risk everything to protect other families. The FBI tells me elder fraud cases have decreased in our region since we shut down the organization. Other criminal groups apparently decided targeting elderly people here is too risky, since word spread about the grandmother who called the FBI and brought down a criminal empire. I like that reputation. I like being known as someone you don't want to mess with. Frank would have been proud of who I became. He always said I was stronger than I knew, tougher than I looked, smarter than people assumed. It took the worst betrayal of my life to prove him right. Last week, I got a letter from David in prison, his first communication since sentencing. For a moment, I wondered if he'd finally found remorse, but it wasn't an apology. It was a request for money for his commissary account, complaints about his unfair sentence, and suggestions I should hire a lawyer to appeal his conviction. Even from federal prison, he still saw me as nothing but a source of money. I threw that letter in the trash without finishing it, but I'm grateful he sent it because it reminded me I made the right choice. The David I had grieved for, the loving son who'd been corrupted, never existed. The real David was someone who could write that letter, still feeling entitled to my money after trying to steal everything and planning my murder. I don't have to feel guilty about destroying his life by calling the FBI. He destroyed his own life by choosing to become a monster. Every night when I go to sleep in my new house, surrounded by people who genuinely care about me, I remember that sometimes the most loving thing you can do is refuse to be a victim. Sometimes fighting back isn't just about protecting yourself, it's about protecting everyone who comes after you. Sometimes the strongest thing you can do is call the FBI on your own son and watch them put him in handcuffs. Sometimes that's exactly what real love looks like. Not enabling bad behavior, not making excuses for evil, but ensuring evil faces consequences. I may have lost the son I thought I had, but I gained something more valuable, knowledge that I'm stronger than I imagined, and the purpose of using that strength to protect others from monsters who wear the faces of family. That's a trade I'd make again in a heartbeat, sweetheart.